Hey there, all you creepers and reapers. Welcome to another episode of the Femme Fatalities. I'm your co-hostess, Anna, and I'm here with the ghoul who's too cool for school, Margaret.
Hello, all you frightlings and grieflings, and welcome to another episode of the Femme Fatalities. Tell us what are we talking about today?
Well, we're going to talk about a few different things, but we're actually going to be referencing an amazing author by the name, you might know him, Stephen King. Probably heard of
Who?
him. Oh, you know, that guy, Stephen King.
Oh, that guy, he runs the horror world.
Right. So we are going to be talking about Pet Sematary today. Just so you know, before we get into the film and the book, it has a lot of horror. There are child deaths, animal deaths, adult deaths, just a lot of death in general, a little bit of gore as well, and a lot of sensitivity to the grieving process as well. So if you have an aversion to any of those things, if you find yourself still grieving and not ready to kind of hear about grief in general, it might be good to fast forward to the next cast. Margaret, am I missing anything?
I think that you've got it all. It also touches on childhood trauma. So if you've got that where it's related to a sibling that is ill and has a lot of health difficulties, it might be a really hard watch for you. Parents, this is probably a couple really hard scenes to watch. Animal lovers, more hard scenes to
Mm-hmm.
watch. Pet Cemetery, really watching it feels like it can punch you in the gut a couple times with some of the scenes.
Yeah. And it's not just a regular punch, it's like a 2x4 right in your tum tum. So,
Yes.
but without further ado, we're going to get right into it. You'll have to excuse me. I need to go park my broomstick real quick. But while I do that, settle down, hang out with some of your little bootastic friends, grab a cup of Bruja Brew, and get ready to hear our cast.
Ooh, yes. So here we are talking about Pet Cemetery. For those of you who aren't familiar, Stephen King wrote this book when he actually lived off of a very busy road that did have semis that drove by. Judd Crandall, the sweet old guy across the street, based on one of his neighbors. The death of the cat happened. The line, I don't know if you knew this, Anna, where the little girl's like, "Can't God get his own cat?" when her cat dies, is actually something that Stephen King's daughter said, as well as the inspiration was Stephen King's son, who is now and also a famous author in the horror world, was running towards the highway. And Stephen King had this flash of what would have happened if I had not caught my son. And that
Wow.
is where Pet Cemetery was born.
That's amazing. And oh my goodness, how sweet about what the daughter said. That's very heartwarming. I have to say, probably one of my favorite things, which is silly, but about the movie is the neighbor casting. I love the fact that Fred Gwynne was selected in the original movie. Herman Munster, also very near where my grandparents had their farm was a town that Fred Gwynne had a farm. And everyone who knew him said he was the nicest man. And I think a lot of that kind of translates on screen. He's this older guy living in his house on his land, trying to be helpful, trying to give a warning to the wise. And I mean, I really think like what you see is what you get, aside from like, you know, the Achilles tendons getting sliced and all that. But I just mean like the kindness, it was genuine. It wasn't just acting. And that really made it for me. Um Also, I love when church just like brings little treats into the house because like if you've ever had a cat, that's not unusual. If they kill something, they'll leave the head or part of the corpse for you to show you that they're doing their job. So in a way, I was like, oh, how sweet. But then I'm like, oh, maybe not. Um, the whole movie, I think, is great. Margaret and I were talking about it a little bit before we started recording and just how it's a really great way to talk about continuing bonds. And I think what we see and hear a lot throughout the course of the text, as well as really all of the films that they've been made, is you lose someone and you want them back. But if you can't let go of the relationship that once was and who they were at the time, what's coming back to you is not going to be the same. And how many times do we get caught looking behind us or in the rearview mirror to the point where we can't see what's around us or what's ahead of us? So I think that's a really important topic for us to address. And what does it mean when we say continuing bonds, and how do you do that? What do you think, Margaret?
Oh, I completely agree with what you're saying. And even as you're speaking, and how Pet Cemetery is showing us how we don't want continuing bonds, and that's where the infamous line comes from. Sometimes dead is better, because sometimes we want our loved one back so much that we make really poor decisions, which Pet Cemetery is touching on. And yet in the beginning, it's beautiful. There is a cemetery that I really thought was a beautiful way to introduce children to grief.
Mhm.
Your pet dies, you're going to have in the remake, they actually have the kids with the
Mhm.
masks and the ones like drumming as they're having this funeral procession to bury the dog that's in the wheelbarrow. And I was like, this is what if, I don't know about you, Anna. I was thinking, what if our society actually treated a child's first death, which is often
Mhm.
their pet, with this ceremony? Yeah, get your friends together. Sparky died. Let's
Mhm.
have this funeral for him. Sadly, our society's like, oh no, kids can't handle death,
Mhm.
which Anna and I, if she wants, we can go into it. Up to about the age 5, they don't understand that it's not reversible. So they're placing the dead one someplace else, thinking they can come back. They
Mhm.
still need to have ritual. It helps them as they get older to be like, oh, now I'm 10 or 8. Now I understand what grandma's funeral was about. Oh, this happened. When we don't get to be part of those rituals, we often then struggle. I don't know if grandma's dead. I didn't
Yeah.
see her dead body. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't have these rites of passage. Not that those have to be the rites of passage. There just needs to be these milestones that help us say, my loved one is no longer here.
Yeah. And I think even though it's not in the horror genre, one of my favorite kind of death episodes of a show that involved kids is the episode of Andy Griffith where Opie has a slingshot and he hits a mama bird. And he's young, so he doesn't understand the permanence of death. And he keeps picking her up and throwing her in the air, saying, "Fly away, fly away." And, she keeps falling to the ground. But what's so poignant about that episode is that she had a nest of hatchlings. And Opie, who's Andy's son, is now tasked with taking care of these baby birds. So I was like, wow, what a great way of showing how to continue bonds and make meaning out of death. Even though it wasn't really an ideal circumstance. I mean, he didn't realize that the bird would die if he hit it. And, as Margaret said, a child's mind can't conceptualize everything, and even an adolescent one can. The other thing, too, that I think is very interesting is you have the children's concept of death, and then you also have these adult concepts of grief and loss, and not even death. So, like, let's look at, I think, someone who really gets overlooked a lot in the storyline, the lady of the house. So here she is, traumatized from seeing her sibling with a horrible disease when they were children. And
Spina
the
bifida,
fact,
right?
hmm?
Spina bifida, right?
Yeah,
Is what
spina
her,
bifida.
yeah.
Yeah, and seeing your sibling go through this and suffer, and you don't really understand because you're a child yourself, the fact that the parents are consistently fawning over her sister, and she feels as though she's almost a slave and helping her sister, and just kind of a caregiver by proxy. In any version, you can kind of read that between the lines. And she's never really healed from that. We don't find out if she's been to therapy for that. if she's done anything that was efficient or effective
Well,
other
she's
than
haunted
internal.
by it,
Oh yeah, I mean
right?
you can
She's
tell she's
haunted. She's
yeah.
having nightmares. She
Hmm.
hears her sister. She has
I mean she's
guilt about
internalized.
that relief of her sister dying, which is
Hmm.
normal.
Yeah, and then you see that she has kind of this, I don't want to say insensitive partner, but I think he could be doing more in terms of nurturing her. And even the kids, like in the remake, I specifically remember him talking about the cat and saying, well, everyone has a metabolism, and when it runs out, you're dead. Like, that is not how you talk to a child about death. That's not how you talk to an adult about death. Um, but I really think that at the end, after Gage kills her and she's taken up the hill into Pet Cemetery and she comes back, which is one of my favorite, probably all time favorite horror scenes where she's just like bloody and pus and maggots and all the delicious things. And, you know, it pans away to the credits and you just hear him scream. But I was talking to a really good friend of mine who had a very difficult previous relationship. And I was like, that's a great comparison for grief and loss related to abandonment and relationships. Because here you are, you need support. The other person is not there to help you. So something else devastating happens that affects them. And they start seeing things a different way. But by that point, you're already moving on. So they want to try and bring you back and rekindle what once was. It's no longer effective. You've moved on. This other person is stuck in the mud with these ideas. So ultimately, you both pay the price instead of working together to just say, let's figure it out, or this isn't working anymore. Let's just move on and try to, resurface in the best forms of ourselves in our lives. And I really enjoy how the book and the films touch on not only grief and death reactions, but also emotional abandonment, spousal support, lack of spousal support, what relationships should look like to us, what they do look like. I also find it interesting that she sends the daughter to her parents because it's like, well, how do they treat this grandchild? They're still grieving for the other grandchild. So, how is this little girl going to be treated? Because we already know the history of their children and kind of what happened when one was sick and one was, whatever we consider to be healthy. So, what's going to happen when one grandchild is dead and the other one is right there?
And I think you touch on something that the first movie really, the little girl, she, right, mom goes with her to her parents' house after
Uh-huh.
Gage dies, and she's having these visions, but everybody's like, whatever, just
Mm-hmm.
pushing it off to the side so we can see the parallel with the mom and the daughter.
Yeah.
That the mom, she's a caregiver, she's terrified of her sister,
Mm-hmm.
and she's just pushed aside. And then that happens
Yeah.
with her daughter. Mom is starting to be like, what is going on? And that's when
Mm-hmm.
mom leaves because the daughter is so upset. She's like, I
Yeah.
had this dream. Gage is back. I had this dream.
Mm-hmm.
Daddy's going to kill you. All these things. And everybody just pushes it, kind of like Pascal, the ghost that is trying to
Yeah.
stop the husband
No, and
from
he's just
doing
like,
all of this.
hello. Yeah.
And the little girl is like, no. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
like in the second one that they did it with Gage because I felt like he was too little and it was at that
Yeah.
age, the parents were like, whatever, you're just a kid.
Mm-hmm. I
I
yeah. I was
I did not like the second one as much
I was
as
disappointed with
I
the
was very
yeah.
disappointed
I
too. So probably
yeah,
focus more on the first one because it
me too.
really did get at all these different
Mhm.
griefs that are
Oh yeah.
impacting the family.
Hmm. Well, and even the second one with like Edward Furlong in it.
Oh, too. I was talking about the remake, but yeah, the second one
Well, I
too.
was
Didn't like that
it
one
was
was
okay. Like to me, it was more humorous than
mhm.
anything. Um, but yeah, the first one is just. I mean, sometimes the first shot is always like the best one. And it's interesting that you actually mentioned like everyone keeps brushing the daughter off, and finally her mother goes home to see what's up, because think about that, she broke the cycle. How
Mhm.
often do you hear things like, if you're feminine facing and your preferred gender is masculine facing, oh well, little girls grow up to marry their fathers, or oh, you never got along with your mom, that's why you're attracted to women like this, or whatever the case is. um we hear that all the time, and when you look at your own behaviors and what you grew up watching in terms of adults behaving and how that shapes you and what you do differently to fix that, or what you're not doing that you should be doing, it speaks volumes. I mean, just through that action of, you know what? I'm not going to ignore my little girl. I need to find out what's going on. I mean, much to her own demise, she does, but just the earnestness of doing that is a beautiful thing.
Yes. That she believed her and that she broke the cycle.
Mhm.
I feel for the little girl. The trauma, the grief trauma. She lost her brother violently,
Mhm.
her dad to insanity, and then her mom
Mhm.
violently
Yeah.
because her dad could not deal with his grief. And how many times
Mhm.
when somebody is grieving do those around them
Yeah.
get impacted? And this really shows us with the dad where it's out of control and he's
Mhm.
not getting any interventions. Nobody's
Yeah.
stepping in. Nobody's trying to help him put a buffer. They're just letting him decompose. And Judd,
Yeah.
the neighbor, he's trying to help. And I always question. I get it for the storyline. He had to show him the pet cemetery. He had to show him
Mhm.
the land beyond the pet cemetery, the bad land.
Yeah.
And I get that for the story. And like, if you really cared, why would you lead this man down this path?
Mhm.
Because then we could go into bloodlines that Judd knew
Yeah.
intimately that that land was bad and nothing
Mhm.
good
Yeah.
came of it.
Yeah. And I think too, like, even if it was completely with good intentions, like, how often do you say, like, don't go here, don't do this, it's a bad idea? And then that entices the person to do it. Like, I can't even, like, think about, like, how many times, I think we've all advised, like, a family member or a friend or, someone in our lives, like, don't go here because of these reasons. And then the next day you get a text like, well, I went to such and such and you were right. Can you come get me? Or, whatever the situation is. So even if he was completely like, good intentioned, it didn't really work out that way. But another thing that surprises me, which I understand for the storyline, but I think about a lot, is the trucker. Think
Hmm.
about
Oh,
what
yes.
he went through just in terms of his own grief. Like, this was an accident. He was not some like joy riding, like skull eating, human flesh wearing person. It was an accident. And, to realize, even without the rest of the storyline, that you are responsible for the death of this small child and everything that their family is going to go through.
Yeah, that guilt,
Mm-hmm.
that that grief guilt, that role guilt that says I had a role in somebody's death and then having to deal with it. Like you were saying, it was just an accident. The family's going to grieve that and they might not feel that it's an accident. Oftentimes
Mm-hmm.
in grief, especially traumatic and violent grief or loss, people want somebody to blame. They want somebody to
Yeah.
hold accountable for the loved one's death. And so we don't see that in Pet Cemetery because nobody's upset with the truck driver. We see it in that the role grief then becomes on the parent, not placed on the truck driver, guessing he's going to have the same.
Mm-hmm.
I caused the death of a child. I've done all this. We see dad absorbing, like taking that on, like, if I had done this, if then my son wouldn't be dead. And I think that's where, in the beginning, we see Judd really trying to shelter the little girl
Yeah.
from death, even though the dad's like, well, animals die. And the mom's kind of like, let's just say that church ran away
Yeah.
so that she doesn't have to deal with death. And here's Judd that's like, well, let's just kind of give her
Mhm.
church back for a moment so she doesn't have to deal with death. And we could look at her character. Now, how's she going to deal with the death of her brother when all of this just
Yeah.
happened with her
Exactly.
cat?
Yeah. And it's like it's the same as like the goldfish dies and you just go buy another goldfish. It doesn't eventually it gets figured out, you know? Um but I think part of it too is just how sterile we are in Western society and how we view death. And you don't want to expose children to the horrors of death, but everybody dies. Like that happens. And that's okay. Like it's just part of life and experience. And I think the disservice is not talking to children, even to say, like, hey there, little Sally. You might notice that mommy's been really sad lately. It's because our dog Spot died, and mommy had Spot since before she had you, and we were best friends, and they talk about it, and I think it's okay for parents to not to censor themselves, but to talk to children in a way that they can understand that their parents are feeling this too, and ask the children what they feel like and what their thoughts are.
Because I feel like you touch on something that this movie touches on too, the wisdom of children. The adults don't want to deal with death.
Mhm.
One thing Anna and I both agree on is in the remake, the funeral procession for the dog and the wheelbarrow, children are working through their grief. They are
Mhm.
doing their own ritual. The adults are the ones that are going to stop that. Children are really good in their own way of doing ritualistic play oftentimes, or drawings that
Mhm.
they're working through the death. It's adults that often stop that because they can't, like the mom
Yeah.
in Pet Cemetery. She has not dealt with her grief, her guilt, the trauma of her sick
Mhm.
sister.
Oh yeah.
So then that gets placed on the daughter. Well, let's
Mhm.
not do this. And the hindrance. So now,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's even like, I mean, I think for me, um, you know, like I'm a millennial, but I think for me generationally, I know Margaret's a Gen Xer. I think that we have some parallels because most of my cousins, there's an age gap, so most of them are Gen Xers, and it was kind of that like you need to be tough. Life is tough. Be strong. If you can't be strong for yourself, do it for the family, and those sorts of pressures as well. There wasn't any kind of, oh, honey, let's talk about this. Let me hug you and, give you some cookies. It wasn't that. And I really don't think either of those are ideal. I think somewhere in the middle is probably the best bet. Um, but it's a lot of pressure. And then, when you're a kid, you're told those sorts of things and it's like, well, what do I do? Just keep it inside and then explode or take it out on myself. And um I think that that can result in a lot of things, particularly with pre-adolescence and adolescence: eating disorders, cutting, promiscuity, um anything that really can put a young person into self-destruct mode. um Definitely is supported by the lack of support and invitation to express how they're feeling.
Yes. So being able to be a support and no judgment here. Death is hard. We all grieve differently. And we live in a society that is very death phobic. So most of us have not been given the tools, the skills. We don't know. So then it's okay. Maybe I didn't have my children participate in ritual. Maybe I didn't do these other things because of my own stuff. How now can I come back and say, hey, do you want to talk about Fluffy's death? Do you want to talk about
Mm-hmm.
Grandma's death? And we can go back and repair.
Oh yeah.
So things are not broken just because we didn't do them when the death
Mhm.
happened. Maybe it's a death anniversary and you say, oh, I did not, grandma died 5 years ago and I
Yeah.
did not handle that well. How do we want to start talking about grandma? What would you like to do? And building that repair and then moving into those continual bonds, because really that's crucial.
Mhm.
Our grief becomes, I don't even know what the words, and maybe Anna, you can help here, because grief is it's a relationship. It feels like our grief is softer, it's not as
Yes.
palatable when we get to the continuing bonds. Like in our grief journey, that's where we're working towards this new
Mhm.
relationship with the deceased, so that we can say, oh, let me tell you about my dad, let me tell you about my mom, let me tell you about Sparky. And I'll get into
Mhm.
pet loss and how that continuing bond feels like it's
Yeah.
a bit more acceptable now in society.
Yeah.
Anna?
I mean, I agree with that. I think anyone who's ever seen Dexter, the way I compare it is that grief is like the dark passenger. It's always with you. You're always carrying it. And I think continuing bonds in a sense are like Harrison when he's a baby, right? So Dexter has this dark passenger grief. In this example, and I know the storyline's totally like not about that. So please don't hate on me or try to cancel me if you're listening to this. I'm just saying if we look at it in a very obtuse way. Um and then you have Harrison who's this kind of new creation and part of you and the goodness that you want, right? So that's how to continue bonds. The grief is this dark passenger over your shoulder that you're working to overcome, but is always with you. And then the continuing bonds help you focus on today and tomorrow instead of consistently looking back or getting stuck in the emotional pileup. You also have something else to focus on. And that's not saying you shouldn't, adhere to your grief. You shouldn't appreciate your grief. You shouldn't experience your grief because, of course, you should. Everyone has a right to do that. There is no set timeline. There is no set formula for how to deal with your grief. The most important thing is that you do find supports for yourself and you're doing it in a healthy way. Um, but it is nice to know that there is more coming. Just think about it, all of the beings that are going to influence you and you're going to influence in your entire span of life, you haven't even met all of them yet, right? So just maintaining yourself and working through the grief, doing the work, going through the process, that's very, very important, and it's incredibly helpful. It's not just going to be something that you can do in 5 minutes. So sometimes it's a lifelong process, and that's okay too.
Yes. I think, Anna, you really touch on that process, that as we have these continuing bonds, there is, first, we have to admit that we've lost something that was very important to us. We have to deal with the abandonment, the loss and the pain of the loss. Oh, Anna, are you there? You went dark.
I'm still here. I just have to
Okay.
adjust my camera.
Oh, okay. I was just checking. Um, so as I was saying, there is this, right, here's the continual bond, and then here's the pain, here's our attachment, here's all the other stuff that we work through together, and then this lessens, and then this becomes the meat
Mhm.
that's holding our new relationship with the deceased. And I feel like this is where rituals can be so powerful. Like we just had Dios de los Muertos, Halloween, holidays that were designed to honor the deceased. Japan
Mhm.
has Obon, where it really is, how are we continuing
Yeah.
our relationship with who died? And I had touched on pet loss. It feels like pet loss is, in a way, really allowing people to have that. I have witnessed so many wonderful ways that people honor their lost pets with tattoos. They
Mhm.
have, um, and there's ancestor altars, which is a continued bond. So they have their like pet shrines. I know somebody that got a beautiful necklace that was made of ashes, I
Mhm.
believe, of their dog, and there's this way that I feel like I'm going to say millennials, because everybody I'm talking about is a millennial that really with pride is like, I lost my pet and
Hmm.
I wear him on my neck. I lost
Yeah.
my pet. Here's my tattoo. Oh, look at my shrine that's to
Yeah.
my pet, that's allowing other generations to say, oh, if you do this for your pet, it's like it's like opening the door to, ooh, and how am I honoring
Hmm.
my lost pets as well as grandma, grandpa, my aunt.
Yeah. Oh, totally. And I think too, just, as a millennial, I think that fewer of us have replicated creating other humans, or we have less offspring than other generations. And oftentimes we do identify our pets as our babies, like as our children. And I think that's part of it too. But, our pets really, they are parts of the family. They're part of our daily routines. Think about it. Do you see your family members every day? Do you talk to them every day? Do you have a routine that they follow with you every day? Probably not. But if you have a pet in the household, you're up at a certain time, you're caring for them at a certain time, you see them, you have every day with them unless you're on vacation, right? So these are not only important living things in your life, they're important to your routine and consistency in your life. When your pet dies, your routine is turned totally upside down, right? You don't have that consistency anymore. So not only are you missing this great love, this little creature that brought you so much comfort and joy, you're on autopilot because you don't know what else to do with yourself. And then
Yeah.
another thing is, how often do we lose a pet and immediately like, okay, get another pet, and they're completely different personality, totally different routine, like, um maybe you had a dog before that w- was a toy poodle, and they had their own stroller, and you would walk them around the park in a stroller or something like that, and then you end up getting a mastiff next, right? So this is a very active dog who needs a lot of physical rigorous activity and engagement throughout the day. That's going to be a huge change. And it's one thing to be on autopilot and no longer have the routine, and then another to change from autopilot to completely different routine, and you're both trying to get used to each other.
Yes, and the ways we cope with that grief, because we just want to fill that hole, and pet loss is such a profound grief that does
Mhm.
not get the just the honor that it
Yeah.
deserves. It tends to be like, oh, it was just your dog, it was just your cat. Like
Mhm.
Anna was saying, these are creatures that are part of our routine. These
Yeah.
are creatures that know most of us better than our most intimate relationships. We tell them our secrets. They're not going to
Yeah.
tell anybody our secrets. They're with us. They're reliable. We
Mhm.
have, we could even argue most of us, and for some people, their only secure attachment is
It's
actually
Oh,
with
yeah.
their pet, and then that's taken
Mhm.
away. And so here is Pet Cemetery again, trying to normalize that. How do we start to honor such beings that
Yes.
are just profound in our life and that society? I think Anna and I touched on this in a previous podcast. Really, oh, it's fine.
Yeah.
Get over it. Not a big deal. No, I just lost a key part of my life.
Mhm. Yeah, and there's such a sense of disenfranchisement when that happens because people don't understand what it's like. It's funny how many people have pets, right? And like many other things, until it happens to you, it might be more difficult to understand. Um, just a little story. I know I've talked before about my Pomeranian and how she was like super awesome, and she actually, when I was in college, the first go round, because we know I've had a couple go rounds, but back when I was young, and innocent and bright minded and happy and couldn't even vote yet, she was a gift from the family member I ended up being a caregiver for my birthday. So when my Pomeranian died, it was like my best friend, my confidant's gone. And also, one of the last connections to that family member that I had is also gone. So oftentimes it's not even just the loss of the pet, it's the loss of what they represented, maybe other family bonds and connections that you have to the pet. I've had a few people I know who they've had a friend die tragically, and then they take their cat or their dog or rabbit or whatever the pet was. And when that pet dies, they're reliving the grief of losing their friend or their family member as well. So it's so multidimensional, and it really is hard. The disenfranchisement is very difficult because, just like our relationships with other people, everyone has a unique and individualized relationship with their pet. And I can actually remember someone telling me, "Oh, well, I had a pet once. I know exactly how you feel." And sometimes when you're grieving, you can get really, really angry. This is one of those days. I did not say anything back to them, but as soon as I got in my car, um, a lot of profanities and just emotional explosions kind of came out. Thank goodness my windows are tinted. Um, because I was by myself, and I'm sure if anyone would have pulled up next to me, they would have had quite a fright if they could have seen me. But it's kind of just that whole, like, that's something you don't say to someone when they're grieving and if they've had a loss, because none of us know how the other person feels. I don't care if it's a death, if someone is getting married, somebody's getting divorced, somebody is adopting a kid, somebody's kid's moving away to college, whatever it is, new job, losing a job, all these different things that happen. You may have had a similar experience and you may want to support that person. One of the most unsupportive things that you can do for someone is to say, I know exactly how you feel, because you don't. And that's
Yeah.
okay. You can say, I know what you're going through, or I've been through something similar, or can I tell you about my experience? What can I do to help you through this? But no one lives in anyone else's mind. We don't know how the other person feels.
Yes, thank you for sharing, and how, again, that disservice, people trying to be helpful say, I
Hmm.
know exactly what you're going through. No, you don't, because every death is different and unique. And Anna, her pup, that was connected to her grandmother. And so it's like a double grief. We
Yeah.
often don't always talk about how one grief will trigger another grief, even if we feel like that grief is resolved. And Anna gave us a perfect example of her dog then reigniting her grandmother's grief, and this and give her the benefit of the doubt, well intentioned. And
Yeah.
so, like Anna was saying, when somebody's going through grief, one of my favorite lines that I learned from an old professor was, I cannot imagine what you were going through.
Hmm.
And that has like stuck with me. So when somebody's
Yeah.
talking about grief, I cannot imagine what you're going through, because I can't. Or we can
Hmm.
flip it and say, I can only
Yeah.
imagine. So can't or can, however, because if I say I can only imagine, I'm telling Anna I'm relating and I don't know,
Yeah.
because I don't know.
Yeah.
And just not to beat yourself up, because we as a
Hmm.
society are learning how to hold space for grief. So again, when you listen to me and Anna, I hope you're learning how to, we get to kind of fumble into this
Yeah.
kind of trip and be like, whoa, thank you so much for sharing about your pet and your grandma, and how can I support you? Or is there
Hmm.
anything you'd like me to do for you? Or can I share about when my whatever
Hmm.
passed away? And then
Yeah.
Anna can be like, no or yes.
Exactly. And, each relationship is different too. I mean, some of us have, friends or family members that we are so bonded and connected with that you can just look at the person and what you can or can't say, right? But
Mhm.
in everyday life, generally speaking, these kind of helpful yet open ended statements and terminologies are really great ways to kind of break the ice and get through the pauses and let the person know, like, hey, I am thinking about you, I am here for you. I just need you to let me know what I may or may not be able to do. And it's okay to say, I'm sorry that you're going through this, right? It's very empathetic. It's to the point. It's a statement that helps people too. I mean, I can't tell you, and Margaret, you tell me what you think, but going through my grief journey, which was very difficult and very lonely, I would have loved for someone just to say, I am so sorry that you're going through this. And when you don't have people telling you that, it really impacts how you feel about yourself and just everything else that you're going through. And like, like honestly, anybody out there who's listening, if you're going through a grief journey or something in your life has changed and you have feelings of loss, like, I'm sorry that you're going through that. I do hope that you have people around you who want to support you. And if you feel like you're alone, don't hesitate to let us know. Like, message us on Instagram, reach out to us, email us. We can help you find supports that will work for you as well.
Yes, you're not in this alone. So hopefully, maybe even our podcast is giving you some comfort. Even the movies we talk about that can hopefully give you some comfort to know that there's other people grieving. And these movies are how many times the writer, the director, the actors that play the roles are bringing their own grief experience to the roles, whether they know that or not. Because horror touches on death, which is grief. And even as Anna was saying, it doesn't always have to be death. Loss is another way grief is minimized. Oh, well, he was no good for you anyways. You
Mhm.
should be grateful. That doesn't mean we don't grieve the relationship. Well, you hated that job. It doesn't matter. Grief is grief, and grief is
Mhm.
the loss of something that was significant to
Yeah.
us. Significant,
Oh,
positive,
totally.
negative, neutral.
Yeah.
It's just significant. And I feel like as a society, we judge that. Oh, you can grieve this. You
Mhm.
can't grieve that you broke up with your ex, or your ex who's been cheating on you left you.
Right.
You need to be happy.
Yeah, you should
No.
celebrate. Like, well,
Yes.
no.
Mhm.
And there's a lot more that goes into it. And even like what we consider to be positive, right? So, how often do you see like a parent having a time with their child getting married? Because it's changing
Mhm.
their dynamics together. It's changing who that is, or even if a kid goes off to college, or a parent that was a stay-at-home parent while the children are young. Now they're adults, and the parent has to go into the workforce again. These are all things that one might think of as new and fun and exciting, but it's also terrifying. And, you're still going through all of these changes and losses at once, too.
Yes. So, yeah, Pet Cemetery really, even they just moved to a new town. Look at
Hmm.
all that adjustment and change. And anything else about Pet Cemetery, Anna, before we?
Well, our big question. Of course, we
Mm-hmm.
can't forget that. Of all the
Yes.
characters in the film, who do you most identify with and why?
Yes, great question. And before I answer, before I forget, little fun fact. I had a cat named Church, who my daughter actually named after the cat in Pet
That is
Cemetery.
awesome.
So
I love
I
it.
just had to say, yes, shout out to Church, who he lived up to his name. He was quite unpredictable. He was cute and cuddly when we got him, and then we got home, and he was not very friendly. So my daughter was like, Church from Pet Cemetery. So yes, I
That
had
is
a
great.
cat named after the movie.
Oh my gosh,
Yes.
that's fantastic.
Yeah. I am gonna have to go with Pascal, the guy that gets hit by a vehicle. So
Mhm.
very foreshadowing of what's gonna happen. Who is just trying to get through to people, anybody who will
Mhm.
listen, and nobody's listening. And he's just like, come on, like, don't do this. I'm like trying to help you, just listen. And then people would subtly listen. He'd be like,
Yeah.
okay, you heard me. So, how about you? Anna,
I
who do you most relate to?
I have to say the little girl, the daughter,
Mhm.
just kind of trying to speak up for yourself and get people to listen to you and just consistently getting brushed off. But eventually I feel like she finds her voice and she's like, "You have to listen to me." And her mother eventually does hear her. So it's kind of the persistence and, eventually being heard out, no matter how long it takes. Like, don't give up, just keep bringing up all the weird crap that you're seeing, and eventually, hopefully, someone does listen, like in the story. But
Yes.
definitely, yeah, I think, and a lot of that too is just how children kind of get pushed aside, and being a cisgender female, it was very of the time too. Like, little girls are polite, they're sweet and full of sugar and spice, and they don't speak back, they don't misbehave, and I think I see a lot of baby Anna in her character as well. So
Oh,
yeah,
yes, pushing back, not subscribing to societal norms, which just want to put us in a box.
yep, definitely, yeah. Like, to paraphrase the movie Seven, what's in the box? Not your societal norms. I'll tell you, it's not that.
Yes. Let's just don't open the box. Let's just get rid of the box. And
Mhm. Yeah.
yes.
Awesome. Well, I think we have dug through the pet cemetery as best we could and poked and prodded almost everything we found. I think we've got some really exciting additional podcasts, some about more Stephen King stuff, some about some other things. We'll be talking about a few other authors like Clive Barker as well. So stay
Mhm.
tuned. Until next time, everybody stay creepy, go out there and be hobbling little goblins and have fun. See
Yes.
you
Take
in your
care
next.
until next time.
Bye bye.
Bye.